The Hedgerows of Normandy, July 1944. The air inside the turret of a Panzer V Panther is thick with the smell of cordite, sweat, and stale oil. The commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front, peers through his periscope, scanning the dense bocage that lines the sunken road ahead. He knows they are coming. They always come. For the last 3 days, his platoon has held this intersection against the Americans. They have claimed 12 kills. 12 burning M4 Shermans, their hulls blackened, their turrets blown askew, littering the fields like discarded toys. By the logic of warfare that this German crew understood, the logic of quality, of superior engineering, of the master weapon, the enemy should be broken. They should be retreating, licking their wounds, waiting for reinforcements that might take weeks to arrive. And the German army, losing a tank company, was a catastrophe that reshuffled entire divisions. It meant paperwork, angry generals, and months of waiting for replacements from factories that were currently burning under Allied bombing raids. So, as the sun rose over the French countryside, the Panther crew expected silence. They expected a pause. Instead, they heard the low, grinding rumble of engines. Not one or two, but a chorus of them. The ground began to tremble, and then, rounding the corner of the hedgerow, came the silhouette they hated most. The high profile, the rounded cast hull, the short 75mm gun. A Sherman, then another, then another. The German commander watched in disbelief as a fresh column of 5 American tanks rolled past the burning wrecks of the 12 that had been destroyed just yesterday. They were brand new. The olive-drab paint was pristine. The white stars were bright and clean. It was as if the battle the day before had never happened. It was as if the Americans were fighting a war with cheat codes, where death was just a momentary inconvenience. This was the moment the German tanker realized that no matter how good his gun was, no matter how thick his armor plating, he was going to lose. He wasn't fighting a tank, he was fighting a tidal wave. There is a famous saying attributed to a German tank commander near the end of the war that perfectly encapsulates this despair. He said, "One of our Tigers is worth 10 of your Shermans, but you Americans always have 11. This wasn't just a witty observation, it was the grim mathematical reality that broke the Wehrmacht's back. To understand why the German crews were so demoralized by the Sherman, we have to look beyond the armor stats and gun calibers that video games and movies focus on. The horror for the Germans wasn't that the Sherman was a super tank, it wasn't. The horror was that it was a Hydra. Cut off one head and 2 more appeared, fully fueled, fully loaded, and ready to fire. To the German mind, a tank was a work of art. A Tiger I was handcrafted. The armor plates were machined to microscopic tolerances. The suspension was an over-engineered marvel of interlaced road wheels that provided a smooth ride, but was a nightmare to repair in the mud. When a Tiger broke down, it often had to be abandoned because the specific part needed to fix it was hundreds of miles away or simply didn't exist because the factory had switched to making Panthers. German logistics were a chaotic mix of horse-drawn carts and dozens of different truck models, few of which shared spare parts. Losing a tank was a tragedy. It was a loss of strategic capital that could not be replaced. Now, contrast that with the view from the American lines. The United States didn't treat tanks like works of art, they treated them like Fords or Chevrolets. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant alone was a cathedral of mass production, churning out tanks faster than the Germans could manufacture bullets. But the volume of production is only half the story. The real miracle, the thing that truly terrified the German veterans, was the American system of recovery and repair. Behind the front lines, the U.S. Army operated a logistical machine that was arguably more impressive than the combat units themselves. When a German shell knocked out a Sherman, the crew would bail out. If the tank didn't burn, and contrary to the Ronson myth, later Shermans with wet ammo stowage were actually quite hard to burn. It was just a hunk of metal sitting in a field. To the Germans, that was a dead tank. To the Americans, it was just a broken car. Within hours, specialized recovery vehicles like the N-32 would drag the carcass back to a field repair depot. These depots were outdoor factories. American mechanics, chewing gum and working in shifts, would swarm over the damaged vehicle. Did a shell punch a hole in the armor? They would weld a patch over it, paint it green, and send it back. Was the engine destroyed? They had crates of Ford GAA V8 engines stacked like cordwood. They could swap a tank engine in the field in a few hours. A German transmission change could take days and require a crane. An American transmission could be swapped by a few guys with a wrench and a pulley. The Germans would shoot a Sherman on Tuesday, watch the crew bail out, and mark it as a kill. On Thursday, that same Sherman, with a fresh weld mark on its glossus plate and a new crew inside, would be advancing on their position again. It was the zombie tank phenomenon. This psychological pressure cannot be overstated. Imagine being a German gunner. You're exhausted, you're running on methamphetamine chocolates and fear. You have barely slept in a week. You line up a shot, your hands shaking, and you destroy an enemy tank. You feel a moment of triumph. You think you have bought your unit some breathing room. And then, 20 minutes later, the gap in the line is filled. The effort feels futile. It feels like trying to hold back the ocean with a spoon. The German diaries from 1944 and 1945 are filled with this specific kind of dread. They stop writing about the inferiority of the American equipment and start writing about the endlessness of it. There is a story from the Battle of the Bulge that illustrates this. A king tiger, the apex predator of World War II, a 70-ton monster with armor so thick no Allied gun could penetrate it from the front, ran out of fuel. The crew had to abandon it. As they walked back towards their lines, retreating on foot, they passed an American supply dump that had been overrun briefly and then recaptured. They saw mountains of jerry cans, millions of gallons of gasoline. They saw crates of Spam, piles of boots, stocks of artillery shells that reached the treetops. The German officer reportedly wept, not because he was afraid of dying, but because he realized they had been fighting a war of scarcity against a nation of infinite abundance. He realized that his king tiger was a beautiful, useless sculpture without fuel, while the crude, mass-produced Shermans were buzzing around like angry hornets because they had a pipeline of gas stretching all the way back to Texas. The Sherman was designed for this kind of war. It was designed to be shipped. It was narrow enough to fit on standard Liberty ships and flatbed train cars. It was light enough to cross most European bridges that would collapse under the weight of a Tiger or Panther. This meant the Shermans could go places the German heavy armor couldn't. They could flank, they could cross rivers, they could keep moving. The Germans found themselves constantly outmaneuvered, not because the Sherman was a better duelist, but because the Sherman was a better traveler. And then there was the human element of the replacement system. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies. German tank crews were operating under constant threat of air attack from typhoons and thunderbolts. They couldn't move by day. They couldn't train new crews because they didn't have the fuel to run training schools. The replacement crews arriving at the front were teenagers with a few hours of experience. They were being thrown into complex machines like the Panther and told to hold the line. On the other side, while the American tank crews suffered horrendous casualty rates, being a tanker in the U.S. Army was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war, the system was designed to keep the unit functioning. If a commander was killed, the gunner took over. If a tank was lost, a new one arrived. The institutional knowledge was preserved because the unit didn't dissolve. The sheer number of Shermans meant that the Americans could afford to make mistakes. A German commander in a Tiger had to be perfect. If he flanked effectively, he might kill 5 tanks, but if he made one mistake, if he tracked his vehicle or got stuck in a cellar, his war was over. The American commander could make a mistake, lose his tank, jump in a new one, and learn from the experience. As the Allies pushed into Germany, this dynamic reached its absurd conclusion. In the Ruhr pocket, German units were surrendering simply because they were awestruck by the traffic. They saw the Red Ball Express, the endless truck convoy supplying the front, and realized the scale of the operation. There were tank parks in France where replacement Shermans were parked bumper to bumper for acres, just waiting for crews. To a German soldier who had been rationing artillery shells and siphoning gas from wrecked trucks to keep his vehicle moving, seeing a parking lot of 500 brand new tanks was a vision of the apocalypse. It broke their worldview. The Nazi ideology was built on the concept of the Übermensch, the superior will, the superior warrior. They believed that spirit and quality could overcome material odds. The Sherman tank proved them wrong.
It proved that in a modern industrial war, good enough built in the thousands beats perfect built in the dozens. The Sherman was the embodiment of the assembly line brought to the battlefield. It wasn't about the individual duel between one tank and another, it was about the system. In the final days of the war, as the remnants of the panzer divisions retreated across the Rhine, they would often look back. They would see the smoke columns of the tanks they had destroyed that morning. But emerging from that smoke, relentless and inevitable, would come the high green shapes of the M4s. Engines humming, tracks clattering, turrets traversing. They were the metal soldiers of a factory nation, and they simply would not stop coming. The German crews didn't just lose to a better strategy or a better gun, they were buried under an avalanche of steel. And as they raised their hands in surrender, walking past the long lines of idling Shermans, the most common expression on their faces wasn't anger or fear, it was disbelief. They simply couldn't believe how many of them there were.